Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Gail Kennedy. I'm a Wangabon woman from the Nyampa-speaking nation of southwest New South Wales. So I will be doing an acknowledgement of country rather than a welcome, because this isn't my country. But I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation of this particular area, and this is also Cammeraygal country as well, the country of the great Black Queen Barangaroo. And I think this is this is actually an excellent event to welcome you all to, because our culture has survived for thousands upon thousands of years based strictly on storytelling, of passing down the stories of our people, of our culture. So I would like to welcome you all here today, and I hope that you learned something. And yes, welcome, have a lovely afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to do the acknowledgement of country to this really special event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail, for that acknowledgement of country. We really appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. My name's Ryan, and I'm going to be your MC for the day. I am an actor, a voiceover artist, and a multi-award winning playwright. And thanks. Yeah, great. We're thrilled to be here at Sydney Theatre Company today. The partnership between Accessible Arts and STC for this panel on the future of disability storytelling is an absolutely fantastic match, given STC's commitment to producing ambitious and impactful Australian works. And now I'm very excited to hand over to Tori Loudon, Head of Public Programs and Engagement at STC. Welcome, Tori.
Thank you, Ryan. So, yeah, we're really thrilled that you're all here. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the elders, Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land and the waters in which we gather. And we do pay our respects to elders past and present, and want to acknowledge that this is a really significant start for storytelling and for the sharing of knowledge. Very appropriate for this afternoon. So thank you all for coming. It's a really great turnout, and for people online as well. We also just want to say thank you to Accessible Arts for partnering with us. I want to give a quick little plug for a workshop that's happening tonight with Crips and Creeps. It's a story commentating workshop, and there's a few spots left, so please come along if you haven't already booked. And we also partner with Accessible Arts on many other things, like we've got the Creatability internship program about to kick off soon, and we'll be hosting Aaron Gold here. So most of you, or hopefully some of you, know that we're currently presenting The Cost of Living, which is co-directed by Dan Dorr and Priscilla Jackman. And it features a stellar cast, including Dan and the incredible Kate Hood. It really is beautiful, it's moving, it's funny, it's nuanced, it's all the things that you want in your storytelling. And if you haven't seen it, do yourself a favour. We've also introduced relaxed performances along with our captioning, our Auslan and our audio described performances, so please spread the word. I don't want to talk for too long. I just want to say thank you all for coming. Thank you all to the panellists. We're in for a treat, and enjoy. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tori, and thank you to the whole STC team. Today I'm joined by a very diverse panel from all across the arts sector on stage. Could everyone please welcome Dan Dorr, director and performer. Fiona Murphy, writer, editor and arts critic. And Michelle Cheng, head of creative diversity, SBS Television and online content division. Our theme today is the future of disability storytelling, which is such an expansive topic with endless possibilities. And before we kick off, I want to mention that we will have time for some audience questions at the end. Both our online and in-person audiences can submit questions via Slido, or if you're in person, you can just raise your hand and we'll get a roving mic around to you. Now, let's kick off the conversation with our first question, which is going out to the entire panel. How has storytelling in the arts evolved over the past decade to better represent people with disability? And can you share any examples of that might have caught your attention?
Yeah, I'm happy to get started. I would like to acknowledge that there has been disability storytelling in Australia for a very long time, over many decades, but I think the key change from my perspective is the power of social media, for good and bad, has really created a sense of connectivity that might not have been there previously. I know from my own experience as a deaf woman, going to a mainstream school and not having social connections with the deaf community growing up was incredibly isolating. And it wasn't until discovering deaf Twitter and just seeing, oh my goodness, these are people with similar interests to me and similar experiences. It made that experience of entering the deaf and disabled community so much easier, because it can feel like a really courageous step when you've gone from a position of being incredibly isolated to suddenly saying, hey, can I join you guys? So I do think that has really given a sense of rocket fuel to the creative sector, in that those personal connections can become creative connections and can become professional connections, and it builds and builds and builds. And I've had the great pleasure of that happening in my own career, where we might start off just as friends and become colleagues. And it does indicate how much work disabled people are doing to establish things. We're not just waiting for things to happen, but we're having to build and build and build. So in some ways it's a real testament to our motivation and determination, but it's also a bit of an indictment to the lack of infrastructure and funding as well. So it's a bit double-edged in that I do think we've got a lot further to go, and we'll get there a lot faster if there was more funding in place.
I'll have a crack.
Please.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm Michelle, and I work at SBS in the TV and online content division. And for some context, I work in the commissioning team, where our goal is, when we look at the cast and crew across the shows we make with production companies and in-house, we want to increase the representation of people who, amongst other groups, identify as people with disability. So I would say, in the time that I've been in the industry, I've seen there's growing awareness amongst broadcasters of our responsibility to be active allies, provide accessible spaces, and I think most importantly, we're asking ourselves the question of who has the right to tell certain stories. So I can share a little bit later, but we have diversity targets for all our on-screen, off-screen roles and career progression on our shows, such that if someone was to come to us with a story that was about people with disability, we would be looking really carefully at the key creatives and cast to see, should you be telling this story before we consider commissioning it.
Absolutely.
Hi, I'm Dan Dorr, and I'm a director and performer, and have my own company in the UK called Dan Dorr Creative Projects, of which I'm the artistic director. And through the work I've done, going back almost 20 years now, I'd say, which makes me feel really old. But really plodding along, and what I kind of noticed is that I've never not been in an integrated working space because being disabled, so I've always been able to, I guess, intercept from the inside and kind of advocate to go, oh, how about we do it this way? And they're like, oh no, and I'm like, no, we're doing it this way because I can't do it that way. And they're like, oh, right, we get it now. So, and then they're actually like, oh, that's actually better for us anyway. So it's been quite the journey in terms of kind of having to set up those structures for myself for the betterment of whoever comes through those doors next. So that feels really important to kind of mention.
Making sure that we're kind of always going forward for the next people.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you. Dan, we might stick with you for this next question.
Sure.
The cost of living recently opened at STC, and it delves into profound themes of relationships and disability. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you and your co-director, Priscilla Jackman, to take on the play?
Yeah, sure. We met in 2018 over coffee, and the sparks just flew between the two of us. And we set out to make a devised work together. But then Priscilla stumbled upon this incredible play called Cost of Living by Martina Madoc. And it's such an extraordinary play. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2019. And it's an extraordinary play for me because it dares to portray disabled people as flawed, and that's such a delight to delve into and to play, actually, to go, yeah, I'm disabled, but I can also be a bit of a prick as well, and I can also not be a very nice, I can be disabled and actually not be a very nice person, that's a real thing in the world, right? So it's really refreshing that Martina, through her observations of being a carer, has sculpted these 4 lives and interwoven these 4 lives, and through the structure of interdependence and care, to talk about the ways in which we all need each other as humans in the world, and that it's not about having a disability or not. It's just like we just need somebody there. But that also, it speaks beautifully to moments in the play where like, and I find this too as a disabled man, like wanting so much to be alone, but I can't because how will I open the jam jar? So it's kind of caught between, I want some solace and some solitude, but that sometimes does come at a cost, and the cost of going without. So it's a play that takes us on that journey of needing so beautifully.
Well, if you needed another reason to go and see Cost of Living, there you are. Thank you, Dan. Michelle, we might move on to a question for you. What trends do you see shaping the future of disability storytelling in Australian film and television?
Well, speaking for SBS, I can say sex. So we have,
good one, yes.
It's a good one. Everyone loves it. So we have 2 shows that were absolute bangers that came out last year and the year before. So one you may have seen is called Latecomers. So it's a 6 by 10 minute series. And we did have Alistair Baldwin, who we love as a director's attachment on that show. And it was sort of what you were saying, Dan. So the premise is that there's 2 characters played by Hannah Divany and Angus Thompson who have cerebral palsy, and they see their carers hooking up, and it leads them to go down their own path of exploring their own sexuality. I think because Angus was one of the writers on the show, you can see that the treatment and how the characters are portrayed is so much more fulsome. And Frank, one of the main characters, he's a pretty bad person. And it's really hilarious. So it was featured at Series Mania. And we think for ourselves, we do want to push the boundaries of representation, work with creators who have lived experience of disability, and just make great content that people want to watch. So sexy stuff.
Wonderful. Sex sells. Good note. Fiona, we've got a question here for you. In your book, The Shape of Sound, you explore disability, identity and resilience through your own personal experiences. And we want to know if writing it changed your perspective on disability representation in literature.
It probably changed my perspective of publishing and the industry more than anything else, because I initially conceptualized the book as being a series of loosely interlinked essays where I wasn't going to feature much in the book at all, other than just a bit of a passing commentary. But when it came to actually selling the book, I had several offers, and the main focus was this would work better as a memoir, because there's a space on the bookshelf for it. It's a little bit different in America, where there are quite extensive non-fiction sections where collections of essays are slightly more commercially viable. We're not at that stage in Australian publishing. There are some collections of essays, but pretty much you have to be bookmarked as a memoir to get a place and to be sold into stores. So I initially, when I got that feedback, I was like, oh my God, they've missed the point. Oh, my art. But then what I really began to understand that it could be quite a powerful position to have it as a memoir, because I realised that if I position the narrator more as a guide, it could be, yes, useful for initiating people into conversations about disability, but it could be quite strategic in flipping the script and putting the mirror on the reader. And the thing that I was interested in was how little people with hearing actually understand what hearing is. And I found that quite fascinating as well. So instead of talking about the deficits I have with my hearing, positioning it in a way that would suddenly make someone curious about their own body rather than disability itself. So for instance, with my form of hearing loss, I was born profoundly deaf in one ear, and I've got progressively losing hearing in my other ear. That means for me, I hear sound all at the same level, all at once, all awash. Whereas if you have two functioning ears, it's almost having like a little remote control where you can, wherever you turn your attention, your brain will amplify that specific voice in a crowded room. And if you turn to the next person, all the other sounds go down and Michelle's voice will come up. Or if I turn to Dan, his voice will come up. Most people with functioning hearing don't realise their brains are doing that. And it's kind of extraordinary. But when you learn that about yourself, most feedback that I got, people are like, oh, does that mean you have to work a little bit harder? And I'm like, yeah, I do. And it's quite nice to actually get someone to have that realization about themselves rather than me just stating, hey guys, I'm really tired. I have to work harder than you, because they just won't get it. So I really use that kind of understanding, positioning the book as a memoir, positioning myself as a guide could be a really interesting way of using the subject material to make it unique and interesting rather than a manifesto, because that wasn't my intention of the book. I just more wanted to illuminate people of different concepts along the way.
Teaching people about things without being didactic is a difficult thing as a writer, but it sounds like you did it very well.
Well, it's more enlivening the body of the reader, because I feel like we do fall into the position as disabled people of always having to talk about our own bodies, whereas the non-disabled person never has to think about their body because it's so normal and perfect and wonderful that it's just interesting to flip it a little bit.
No, that is very interesting. Thank you. we're going to move back to Dan now. Dan, when creating art, what ethical considerations guide your approach, and what role does community input play in ensuring your work resonates with those that it represents?
Yeah, when I make work, I think a lot about the audience, and I hold the audience quite close to me from the very beginning of the process. In terms of like I really want acknowledging that the audience has essentially funded the art I'm making. Kind of, I see it as my kind of social responsibility to kind of hold them up here while I make it, and put everything through that lens. And I'm a very firm believer in, because not always, but sometimes minorities when making work sometimes get into the habit of you're doing this to me, you're doing that to me, and it's like they're actually not, because they've come to see your show. So it's kind of, so I find it more helpful and ethical to, and where I've found a lot of joy and release in the work I make is through making work about the things I'm grappling with or finding hard in my life. Because if the audience is seeing me in the act of trying to work through something and get out the other side of a dilemma or a sticky situation, it kind of, looking at myself, kind of, it does, it forces the audience to look at themselves. So I really love in the work I make, it's like holding up a mirror to you all, going, you know, and it's like, oh yeah, it's like I could think about that for myself as well, that's really good, rather than going, you're not doing that, or you need to do this, kind of leaving it up to the audience always of what they want to take away with them. It feels really ethical. And I'd also say in all of the work my company makes, we have something called pre-show access, which means there's literally a table and a couple of chairs outside of the theatre door that has a list of all the trigger warnings that audience might be able to encounter. There's a booklet that's a step-by-step description of what's going to happen during the show for people. There's an easy read document for them to sit down with in the foyer with a drink if they want before the show. There's the opportunity for them to come into the theatre an hour beforehand to see how bright the lights are, to see how loud the music is, and if it's general admission, a chance for us to stick a post-it note with their name onto a chair, onto a seat in the auditorium that best fits them. All of our every show is surtitled through QLab. So it's all these little things that we've kind of thought ethically we can do in-house, and so that comes as part and parcel of our production without the expectation of from a venue to go, oh, can you also provide the access for this? It's literally asking the venue for a table, 2 chairs, and a strip of blue tack to put our signs up, and a translator to translate our signs if it's not in English. So it's a surefire way that we can make sure our work is always being as accessible as it can be without relying on others to do that for us.
I hope all of the theatre companies in Sydney were listening to that. Thanks, Dan. That was great. We're going to open it back up to the entire panel with, just such a small question about AI. How do you think AI tech will impact storytelling in the Australian arts industry? And what opportunities or challenges do you expect? Yikes.
I'll have a crack.
Crack?
So I think with AI and creative industries, it's important to note, say, AI can be your friend, suggest structures, help you out with certain things, but I don't think that AI will ever replace human creativity, and the reason is because it's trained on past data sets, so it can't predict the future. It doesn't have that creative genesis as life experiences evolve, so I think the robots will not take our jobs just yet.
I absolutely agree. There's lots of benefits of efficiencies and components of accessibility that people are discovering as AI matures and develops. But I do have definite concerns about representation through anything that's sort of, you've seen all the kind of images that are being kind of digitized or created by AI. I don't even have the terminology for this, but they're essentially the perfect individual who looks like a supermodel, and that's quite concerning because I've yet to see in just kind of, doom scrolling through the internet, any AI generated representation of people with disability at all. I really do wonder how much information is in AI algorithms about disability. And if they're pulling it from the medical literature, that's even more alarming because there's a real eugenic bias underlying a lot of scientific research, which is the bedrock of our science, and is quite unfortunately, if that's the source of it all, is an unfortunate pathway we could be going down. Where it leads in terms of creativity, I agree with Michelle. I don't think there's any risk at this stage, but I do think the MEAA union and really that collectivism is really important at a time like this, where we're at least talking about the risks and making the risks well known, even if it's hypothetical at the moment, because I think we would need to take a collective action to ensure that people's intellectual property is safeguarded.
No, absolutely. I know for me as a voice artist, AVA, the Australian Association of Voice Artists, has been in Parliament talking about laws and ways that we can protect our voice identities. So there's definitely people trying to put those things in place, which is very good. Yeah. Dan, did you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, it makes me think of how, I'm also quite scared of disability erasure and how that could potentially be a thing, or kind of because it's so, because we're doing so much work in this sphere around diversity and intersectionality, my worry is that it will be broad brushstrokes, and we'll go back to, disabled people are in wheelchairs. And then kind of take us back to that, and without including the kind of nuance and actually vibrancy within our culture, because actually we're building a culture here, and we always were. But now we've actually got words for that now. Or we've kind of felt more comfortable. We're going a culture together. So I'm just scared that AI will kind of take that away to literally a two-dimensional place, and what that could do. But also I'm really excited about the potential for studies to be done around how AI could help with access, and further that. So I guess it's all about who these systems are being built by and who they're for, and that being part of storytelling, I guess.
No, that's a great point. Who makes them and who are they for? It's something to think about. We could talk about this one question all day, but I'm going to keep us moving. Michelle, SBS is exploring creative audio description across some of its programming. Can you tell us more about that and how it's shaping a new framework for access across the screen industry?
Absolutely. So for a bit of context, I guess we get our TV shows in two ways, so acquisitions and commissions. I work in the latter. For our acquisitions, we work with a company called Red Bee Media to do audio description, but all of the audio description for our commissions is made in-house. So a couple of years ago, so around 3 years ago, we started up some audio description initiatives with a view to making our AD really descriptive, authentic, and we have a thing called bespoke AD. So we do have a style guide on how we want that to look and feel, and our main principle is, say we had a show, we want the audio description to match the tone and the vibe of the show. And I suppose we sit somewhere in between the UK and the US views, where the UK would want neutral sort of AD, and then, America wants more personality. We're somewhere in between. So we make about 27 to 28 hours of new audio description every week, and we have an in-house audio description producer who works with production companies on AD scripts. And we also work with quality control people who are blind and low vision to check our body of work.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you. Fiona, we have a question for you. How can narrative techniques and storytelling frameworks help shift the perception of disability from a tragedy or an inspiration to recognising it as a natural part of the human experience?
I think there's been a lot of threads of that coming up through this conversation, because part of the framework of storytelling is the production of storytelling as well. Because unfortunately, it's good and bad, but often the role of the disabled creative is often capacity building. You're there as an artist, but you're also there guiding people along the way. And I think Dan's examples that he provided of what his production company provide in and around the actual event allows disabled storytelling to thrive, because it is that back and forth with community and ensuring that there is as many people in the room as possible participating. Similarly, watching on television, having that user testing, that SBS isn't just going off and doing a plug and play and just saying, we got it right, guys, this is so good, but actually getting that feedback. I think they're the frameworks that are so important. And part of that is making sure that the funding's in place, because for many decades it's been that invisible labour of capacity building of the artist, of the creative, of the production company, setting up that infrastructure, and then knowing as soon as you leave the room or that production finishes, you kind of have your fingers crossed hoping that that capacity building will stay. But often knowing that actually they only did it because Fiona needed it or Dan needed it, and then it's kind of back to sort of the basics again. And in terms of, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about funding, I do think there's a chicken and egg situation for a lot of disabled creatives, that the work that you choose to create, does it have to reflect you and your lived experiences of disability, or can you just go completely left of field and write about dragons if you want? You're sort of always connected to your disability, whether you want to be or not. It sort of kind of carries with you throughout your career, which can be a really powerful thing, but it's another level of reality that just coincides with someone who is disabled or comes from a lived experience that is considered to be marginalised as well. So when I think about disability storytelling, I don't think about just the output. I always zoom back out and think about the infrastructure that exists around someone, because quite often it's the creative having to build it.
No, that's a really good point. That extra level of energy that you often have to give and provide on top of the energy of giving the art or the story that you're telling is interesting. And we're going to throw it to the whole panel now. We are actually talking about funding. Great. How has the ever-changing funding landscape contributed to fluctuations of disability-led programs? And what steps can be taken to ensure their long-term support and sustainability? No small questions here today. Yeah, that's great.
A moment of grim silence from everyone, maybe. I'm happy to kick off with that. I know I'm really interested to hear, Dan, you speak about the difference between Australia and UK funding. I know definitely in Australia there's been a lot of work towards changing funding models as well. And it's really great that there's disability-specific funding in the arts, which is really exciting. But at the same time, it feels so early days with it, because essentially every art form is compressed into the one opportunity for funding. So there is that perception from non-disabled people that there's so much money for disabled people, but essentially if it's an open art form opportunity, you're competing against the best 5% of dance and music, theatre making and literature, so 5% plus 5% plus 5% plus 5% across all art forms. That is actually more competitive to get disability funding than it is if you're just getting literature funding, where you're just against 5% of the best in literature. So that's something that I find really interesting, that actually mathematically it is so much harder to get awarded funding with that current infrastructure, that it seems like a huge win for the community, but it actually creates a lot of difficulties for people to be able to transition from emerging to established.
Yeah, and how do you compare dance to a novel, to an album, to a theatre show? That seems like so many extra steps.
Which is why it comes down to the best of all those art forms, because you sort of have to aggregate it to just the top, because there might be hundreds of applications and it's whoever's got runs on the board might be where the panel decide the funding go. Whereas if it was just one art form, there would be more of a sense of ecology and spreading that out potentially. But it is a high risk, and I don't think people who aren't within that space recognise how incredibly competitive it is. So if anyone's ever got disability funding, should be incredibly proud of themselves, because it's what a feat.
Dan, did you want to?
So just to talk a bit about the difference between Australian and UK funding. In the UK, they actually don't have rounds, so you can submit your application anytime you want, and there's a constant assessment. Like they'll assess applications like once a week or once a fortnight, so it's just rolling like whenever, and we actually and there are no disability specific rounds. So it's just all in one, and there's as part of the application on the online system, you're asked to submit an access budget. And it's for applying for funding up to £50,000, I'm allowed to apply for £20,000 in access costs, in addition to that £50 project. So it's a separate budget being given purely just for the access for that project they're investing in to make happen. So because they found that if they're expecting artists to pay for the access for their project as well, they're actually spending £30,000 on the project and £20,000 on the access, which then subsequently lowers the quality and excellence of the work they're setting out to fund. They realised that to give themselves as the Arts Council a fighting chance of funding work of the highest quality, they were to fund it in a way that would give them that. And it's so great because we like the artists talk and companies talk and go, oh, what are you working on? When are you submitting? Oh, can you wait a couple of days to submit? Because I'm submitting today. So it's a kind of try and coordinating to get the best so that disabled artists aren't in direct competition with each other, and it betters disabled artists' chances in getting the money, because they're going, oh no, this disability arts project is better, so we're going to give it to that one. But if we spread them out, it guarantees more of a hit rate, success rate. So I really recommend Creative Australia look at how it could do an always open application system, because it does just make it more accessible. And it does mean that, and it also means that we can keep plodding away at an application for 6 months. And then we can just submit it when it's ready, rather than going, oh shit, there's only 3 weeks until, and so that allows us to get all the things in a row. And also if the tides change, for us, but also if the tides change in the government landscape, we can fine-tune our application to then speak to what's happening, kind of in the bigger framework of like where are the government's priorities right now, and kind of changing the project to kind of speak to those better.
That's phenomenal, thank you. We might just keep moving along because we've got limited time. Michelle, what does SBS do to support diversity among its behind-the-scenes workforce, including writers and directors, producers and crew? And can you highlight for us any specific programs that are aimed at recruiting and supporting disabled professionals in the screen industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a little bit building on what Fiona was saying about creatives being forced to bear the onus for building the infrastructure. At SBS we believe we have a great responsibility to bear that onus ourselves, right, and set an example, because it's sort of harking back to funding. It's about who holds the purse strings, who's setting the agenda, and who holds the power in these creative industries. So for us, this is not very sexy, but we have specific deliverables for production companies that tie back to our diversity targets. So for context, on all our commission and channel productions, we have disability targets. So for unscripted, we have taken all the shows we made for 3 years, and we have a target of 5 to 10% people with disability across all on and off-screen roles. And then for scripted, it's slightly different. So we have a show-by-show target where if, for example, a show was made about people with disability, we would expect that amongst the key creatives, at least 2 people in the writer's room in main roles had that lived experience along with either director or producer. So these are really strict commissioning guidelines. They apply to anything that we would pick up, and we would be questioning production companies who came to us who didn't meet those requirements as to, how are you going to change your staffing. So that's one thing. So it's one thing to have your targets there, but the other thing is how you measure them. So we work really closely with the production team at SBS. So we have up to 4 legal requirements, 4 deliverables for production companies, where it tells us, we measure diversity using a third-party tool called the Everyone Project on all our shows, and we publicly report on target performance. And there is one particular sort of plan that our commissioning editors can mandate. So at a very early stage, so even as a development deliverable, they can ask a production company to fill out a cultural safety plan. And for example, that was triggered on one of our recent shows, amongst other shows, Erotic Stories, which did feature an episode called Bound about a character called CJ who wore leg braces and was exploring his sexuality again. And what we do ask production companies is a series of questions to think about how they are setting themselves up for success. So for instance, one thing we ask is, given the subject matter of your show, who have you engaged behind the scenes with that lived experience and for how long? Because we want to catch instances of people bringing on creators in a very tokenistic and not meaningful way. Another thing that we do ask is that production companies appoint a cultural safety contact person of the existing crew. So it could be the series producer, executive producer, and then we do check back. And another thing that we were very lucky to receive was training from Screen Australia about access coordinators. There's one in the room, Sophia, hello. She's there. So we learned that Screen Australia has trained 12 access coordinators across Australia and New Zealand to work on television productions at a very early stage. So that's something even our head of production finance and the commissioning team attended. So we're aware of how much it costs, how we plan ahead to really make sure it actually happens.
Those sound like fantastic initiatives. Oh my God, SBS, go. We've got our last panel question here before we move on to some audience Q&A. So get your questions ready on the slider. What is your vision for the future of disability storytelling, and what key changes do you believe are necessary to achieve this vision? Boy, that's a big one.
I just want to start by saying I think there's something really quite there's a real fundamental shift in that we're having this conversation within the building of Sydney Theatre Company. So I really want to acknowledge that this feels like a landmark shift in the sands in terms of what stories are being told, and the fact that cost of living in a 50-50 ratio main stage production is happening there. And that's really special to kind of, like, we need to acknowledge that before we then go on to talk about what's not yet happening. So I just want to kind of start us off there to go, yeah, we're well on our way, and it's about going, how do we continue this momentum? And we've got, and I'm really interested in see how we continue this forward momentum, because I'd hate to see us go back. And can theatre companies around Australia commit to there being at least one production every season where there's 50% representation in a show? But I am really interested in that exploring that possibility to go, what would that look like, and how would that really change the landscape we're within.
Thank you, Dan. That's great.
I absolutely agree with Dan that acknowledging the work that has happened is really important, and I do think targets are something that does sustain momentum, because forces the institution to step up. So the targets that Michelle was talking about at SBS is really important, and I really like that target as well that Dan mentioned. It would be absolutely fundamentally change the landscape and create that sustainability, particularly that's so important with that endurance of having a disability, of knowing that it isn't just the one opportunity of your career, but there's multiple opportunities. In terms of literature, I've been really excited to see the support network shift a lot, particularly in the last 5 years. Victoria was really leading the way, Writers Victoria in particular, of creating disability-specific literature opportunities, which has created this real wellspring of disabled writers and a real rich community, which fortunately, New South Wales has followed with Varuna doing the writers' space and a lot of work there and creating that physical infrastructure as well at the writers' house of having a completely accessible studio. Similarly, Queensland and Adelaide, South Australia are doing a lot of work. So the last 5 years alone, the landscape is completely changing in terms of disabled literature. That wasn't even a phrase before that, but it's become this real thing. And in terms of my vision for the future, a really specific one would be just to see Auslan and sign language in general on television, to have its own production, its own channel even, because we are decades behind the UK and USA, and the only time we see Auslan represented on TV is when it's a crisis, it's a translation. There's only one instance that I can actually remember of two adults signing to one another in a conversational manner, and that was on an Australian story. And we don't get that representation of people just conversing in sign language. It's always this mode of communicating outwards, which doesn't show the dimensionality of the language, and it's just a massive gap in Australian television.
More people just being people the way they be people.
Just chatting away.
Yeah. Michelle, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would want to see a future where all our friends at every single broadcaster and screen funding agency in Australia treats disability access in TV as a priority and backs that up not only with strategy but accountability. Because I think it's very easy to say, oh, we support a certain group of people, and you get the press release, you get the accolades, but you don't actually take action on it. So I think we need to get to a place of accountability and sort of a vision of the future that I see is I was lucky enough to go to the TV festival in Edinburgh last year, and I learned that there is an alliance of most of the major British broadcasters and streamers called the TV Access Project, where they dedicate real resources, real time, and they have, I believe, sub-working groups to really progress representation of people with disability in TV. So I wish we would get there as an industry.
No, that'd be fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for this wonderful conversation, but I think we're going to move on to questions from the audience now. If you've got questions, if you're online, send them through via the Slido. You can also send them through on the Slido if you're here in the room. But if you're here in the room, you can also just stick up your hand and we'll get a roving mic around to you. So please, questions. All righty.
Hello, my name's Polly. I wanted to ask on that topic of particularly Auslan and learning sign language. I studied at NIDA, I did the BFA course, and we had a very short introduction to Auslan, and then we were encouraged as actors to go and study ourselves online to find that. That was about 7 years ago now, and I'm still personally struggling to find the avenues to study myself Auslan so that I can provide that service as an actor. I can't get myself into a wait list. I can't. I've just been really struggling to try and get into that course to learn that skill, because it would be an awesome skill to have. And I know you guys might not have the answer. I just wanted to say that out loud here so that someone down the other end of the camera can hear that. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a really good thing to bring up, where there is always that enthusiasm for access, not just Auslan in general, but then there's a real dearth of resources or finding out information. I can chat to you later about a couple of pathways and options as well, but that is something that needs to be grappled with as well, because there was a real enthusiasm for learning sign language, particularly during the pandemic, and there hasn't been those avenues, and it's that sort of, where do you put the resources? Do you put the resources towards people wanting to establish a new career and add it as a string to their bow, or do the resources go towards people who are deaf and hard of hearing and requiring the language? I think that's still a very complex place to navigate, particularly when there isn't sufficient funding or a sufficient national plan. There are steps in the direction of getting more interpreters, but it still comes back to resources and funding, unfortunately.
That's a fantastic question. There are, I can't see any questions on the Slido yet. So we'll keep going in the room. Thank you.
Hi. Okay. It's a sort of more directed to Michelle, but everyone can answer it. It's more a question about the making, because I know that sometimes we talk about representation as like who's on screen, even who's behind the scenes, but I know that sometimes the making of television and film, and I know sometimes theatre, but I think I'm not as familiar with theatre, so I'm not sure how it can be a little bit more flexible, I'm not sure. But I know in film and television, we have these 10, 12, 14-hour days. And some of those days are really, they're real barriers to lots of disabled makers. So I suppose, I'm not even sure how to articulate it as a question, but I think that's something that we really need to rethink, I suppose. And how do we approach that? And I know that there's lots of producers and they say, oh, it's all about budget and stuff like that. But yeah, I guess this is something we have to really think about. And I know something that the screen access coordinators talk about. But yeah, I think it's quite preventative for a lot of CRIPs to, just work on sets and work on things. So I'm not sure if that translates to all the other like the literature and stuff, but sorry. Terribly articulated, but you get it.
I totally agree. I think the way we work in television places incredible pressure on access and enabling people with disability and people with care responsibilities, often women who do become mothers, and men and non-binary people who do become parents, primary carers as well. So I totally agree, and it's a really difficult problem to solve. So I would say there's two things. We can start small. So when we're thinking about, planning a television production, we have to think about these things early and not leave it to the last minute. And I would say also looking at engaging an access coordinator to help guide through that process is something which would be really instructive, but it is a big problem.
I do think there are some structural things across any industry. There is that sort of real lack of recognition that there are disabled people in the workforce, regardless what the workforce is. One thing that has been really useful, because there are, particularly in creative industries, very long meetings, or when you're assessing grants and things like that. One thing that I always recommend is that there's an access check at multiple points along the way of a project, and that just becomes a really fantastic structure that just becomes part of the texture of a meeting, so that there's always an acknowledgement of country that everyone's on, and then there's a check-in of access, and then building that into a meeting agenda or a planning day or whatever it is, that people have a chance to flag throughout. And again, it's a subtle way of capacity building organisations, that access isn't a one-off question as it typically is with the HR department, and they note it down and they never reference it again, but access should be continually asked about, because the disability experience is one of complete flux. How somebody feels in the morning is completely different to lunch compared to the afternoon. And whilst we might have a static diagnosis, our bodies are continually changing as our access needs. And I think what Dan described earlier of having that opportunity of people coming into a theatre an hour beforehand, that person can make an informed decision if it's for them or not. It's not the institution or the production company saying, this isn't going to be for you, but it's really putting that, allowing the consumer to make a choice. And I think similarly, workers should be able to be part of that decision making as well.
And yeah, totally. And to add to that, I think there's I think rest has become quite a dirty word in our industry, and it's seen as lazy, or it's seen as unproductive to rest. And one thing I love about our company is that we've always got bean bags around the place. We pull in a sofa into the room so that the people who need it, who have got chronic illness and disability, can just go from their laptop, go from the production desk, and just go have a kip whenever they want, without and knowing that, without worrying that the rest of the company is going to be judging them for taking a nap during rehearsal, because it's about trusting that they will get the job done, or just going, look, can we break for lunch half an hour earlier today because I need to call my doctor, or I need to run off and do this thing. And acknowledging that, sure, we have a business to run, but we're running it with people. So I think we really need to inject care into all of the schedules we build, to actually go, oh, this is people doing this. Oh, I wouldn't want to be sat in the office from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. So why am I writing a schedule to expect other people to do that? And so I find that like it's almost pornographic in a way. And I find it really, really, like, it fascinates me. So part of the work I do is about changing that kind of thing, and like, no, rather than 2 days of bumping, how about we do 3 days, and then we can do 10 till 6 each day. And so that the people in the theatre are working the same hours as the people in the offices, and then we might also actually have the time and space to have dinner together as an entire company, to really check in and see how we're all going and what we might need from each other. That feels really important through the lens of disability justice, and actually just being a human in the world, because you'd be concerned if your partner was continually working long hours, and I think we need to pay that same respect and attention to the people we work with as well.
That's fantastic. Do we have some questions from the Slido?
Yeah, we have some online questions.
Brilliant.
This is for the entire panel. It's asking, what visionary models of collaboration and commissioning between creative individuals and organisations have you witnessed, or do you wish could evolve, and how can these be fostered?
Can we just hear that one again, just for me?
I'd love to, yeah. Let's give it another bell. What visionary models of collaboration and commissioning between creative individuals and organisations have you witnessed, or do you wish could evolve, and how can these be fostered?
From a literature perspective in arts funding, I think a huge one is uncoupling disability funding from a mentorship model and just giving the money to the creative, that they can go off and do what they want to do without having to set up a mentorship, because that sort of paternalistic framework was in Australian arts funding for a hugely long period of time, and non-disabled people didn't have to find a mentor regardless of where they were in their career. And I think it's really exciting that that has finally been decoupled, because it was a bit weird.
We have another online question. It's given that larger media groups and organisations are the ones that are developing disabled stories, and the ones who can provide funding to artists with disability are generally owned by non-disabled persons. How can we get these groups to tell disabled stories and give a sense of ownership and agency in these stories?
Well, surely that, to me, that comes back to all of this talk that we've had, Michelle, about community engagement and some of those lovely things that SBS is setting up. That seems like one way that we can enable some of these things that this question is asking.
Could we repeat the question again?
Brilliant.
Absolutely. Love to. It's asking that these larger media bodies and organisations are behind a lot of development in contemporary storytelling, and they're the ones that can provide funding, right, to these artists. But they're generally owned by non-disabled people. So this person's asking then, how do we get these sort of groups, these sort of organisations to tell these disabled stories and specifically give a big sense of ownership and agency?
Okay, I understand. So I suppose the demographics of the television production industry are what they are right now at this point in time. We could say, hopefully, maybe in 5 years, 10 years, it may shift. But if we were saying, for argument's sake, they were to continue as they were now, we would ideally like to get to a place where, production companies are owned and operated by people with lived experience of diversity. But in the interim, we have to work with what we have, I guess you could say. So what we've seen is, I guess, meaningful collaboration. So what I mean by that is, say we had a team of key creatives. We would have, people with the lived experience collaborating with people who may indeed own the production companies, but they know how to meaningfully collaborate. And what I mean by that is they know when to let the people with the lived experience share their voice and perspective, and they work together to enable that. And hopefully over time we'll get to a place where we're building capacity, we're building critical mass, and we don't have to do that anymore.
Okay, we've probably got time for one or two more. One really short one. Has anyone got a really short question?
Okay, so my question's about capacity building. Basically, people with lived experience of disability either have to be litigious, make complaints, or explain to someone what a disability adjustment is. And I was interested in what you were saying, that organisations, they'll go, oh, yeah, well, we'll just do this for Fiona, we'll do this or this for Dan. But then when you've gone, you realise that you cannot leave a legacy there. So how do you, one, just make it easier for yourself, because it makes me exhausted even thinking about the word disability adjustment. How do you make it easier to communicate, easier for yourself, and just to develop that capacity within that organisation without taking on all the responsibility? Yeah, that wasn't that short.
I think our legal system does put the onus on the person with a disability to gather the evidence and mount the argument that discrimination has happened. There's a fundamental flaw of our legal system. I do think asking every single person if they have an access requirement is going to be the path to normalising that everyone has access requirements regardless of if you have a disability or not. So I think it's going to be an interesting path not to result in disability erasure taking that, but I think it will get people more comfortable, because research shows that most people feel so uncomfortable even saying the word disability. I think really utilising the word access and even making it simple or plain English, what can we do to make your job easier, or what do you need to do your job better or in a more comfortable way? So it's kind of working around it, but getting into that rhythm and pattern and asking it consistently, so it should be built into workplace structures.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, I'm afraid...
We really need to wrap up, only because we're timed, we're streaming, and we have interpreters and access requirements going. So sorry to be the boring person to pull the plug, but I encourage you to come and be with us down the hall, and we can continue the conversation. If you're beaming in, I encourage you to get in contact with Accessible Arts, engage with our training and all the wonderful ways that we can connect with you and stay connected. It's been such a beautiful conversation this afternoon, and I thank each of you for the depth of knowledge and the insights and experience that you've each brought to this conversation. It's not that long ago when we were sort of stuck talking about the real basics, and it's really wonderful to be in your company and hear this level of conversation unfold, and I feel very lucky, and thank you. So please join me in thanking the wonderful panel. Fiona Murphy, Dan Dorr, Michelle Cheng and Ryan Ennis, thank you very much for your time. On behalf of Accessible Arts, I'd like to thank STC for hosting us, and in particular Tony Loudon and Ben Stern, but also the entire team. The help today and all the help behind the scenes in the previous weeks, we really appreciate it. Also our partnering company Live Crowd for doing the fantastic job beaming this across the nation, and it is very much across the nation. We have about 160 in the room today, and a total of, well, I can't do the maths on the fly, but I know it's over 620 RSVPs we had, so that's a lot of people online. So thanks for tuning in and keeping this front of mind in your thinking and planning. I'd like to thank the team at Accessible Arts. We are a very small team, and I want to thank each of you for all the work that you've done to contribute to this event in particular. This Access Ideas and Insights series is funded by City of Sydney and Create New South Wales, and we'd like to say thank you for their ongoing support. And so you know, we have the next Access Ideas and Insights booked to be at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in December. It will be on creative partnerships, and really hope that you'll be able to join us then. Keep an eye out on the e-newsletters and the socials. If you're an artist with disability, you'll be thrilled to know that we'll be announcing Bundanon Artist Residency on Monday the 29th. If you're a New South Wales artist, check it out. Put your hat in the ring. The residency runs from the 4th to the 10th of November. It'll be open for applications from the 29th of July until the 8th of September. As Tony mentioned, Crips and Creeps are doing a comedy storytelling kind of workshop this evening at 6:30. There's a few spaces left. If you want to do it, go on, do it. Do it. It'll be here at STC. It'll be a lot of fun. They're a great team putting it on, Maddie and Sam. You'll love it. It starts at 6:30. So come and find us and have a chat if you're keen. Of course, cost of living, I've gone over. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.